Let's talk about immigration during the Gilded Age. The largest wave of immigration in our nation's history occurred during the Gilded Age, and that's what I'll be talking about today. What you see pictured here on the left is you see a family arriving by ship, most likely into New York, although people did arrive at other locations as well. Baltimore was an important port for immigrants to arrive in, and on the West Coast, Angel Island was an important port where immigrants came as well, although that would have been most likely people from Asia, such as Chinese and Japanese. What you can see on the right is, again, an immigrant family, and they are looking into the distance, and of course you see the Statue of Liberty there, which has always been seen as a very welcoming site for these immigrants, at least after 1886 when it was erected in New York Harbor. And here you see a modern day photograph of the Statue of Liberty, and it shows you the dimensions of the Statue of Liberty basically, and just how large she actually is. This was a gift to the Americans from the French. It was initially going to commemorate the Declaration of Independence, the centennial of that, which would have been in 1876, although they weren't able to secure enough funding in France to have it completed by 1876. So it actually arrived here in 1885 and was officially opened in 1886, about 110 years then after the Declaration of Independence. But I have talked to you previously about liberty and how liberty is a goddess-like figure that has symbolized America and democracy and the Republican style of government that we have. And this statue was a gift really showing the brotherhood between the United States and France. The top part, the statue itself, was designed by the French. It was actually designed by a sculptor there. It was dismantled, it was brought back to the United States, and it was put back together. The bottom part, or the base, that was created in the United States. You can read the famous poem here by Emma Lazarus. It's a portion of a poem called The New Colossus, and that poem is inscribed on a plaque on the base of the Statue of Liberty. And it just really refers to the fact that the people coming here, these immigrants, sometimes they were hopeless and helpless in the places that they were coming from, yet in America it provided them with hope, and that we were willing to take these people. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. Bring them here. We will give them that hope that they deserve. I lift my lamp beside the golden door, and that golden door is just a symbol of these new people entering the United States. And it was so important for us to have these people coming into the United States because we needed the labor. The Gilded Age, that unprecedented economic growth, we had a lot of factories, a lot of industry, we needed that labor. In addition, if you go to New York Harbor and you see the Statue of Liberty, not far from there is Ellis Island, and that's a location where about 12 million immigrants came between 1892 and 1954 who arrived in New York. About half of all Americans today can trace their ancestors, or at least one ancestor, to coming through Ellis Island in that period of time. So it's a very important location. There's a museum there today if you ever get a chance. I think it's a neat place to go. Okay, there were previous waves of immigration in American history we just need to talk about a bit. And the first would be colonial immigration. It was any immigration up until 1776, which of course is when we mark the birth of our nation, basically, with our Declaration of Independence in that year. Previous to that, anybody who came into the country would have been considered part of this wave of colonial immigration, mostly people coming from England, or the British Isles. African slaves as well. Obviously, they did not come here voluntarily. Then you have a mid-19th century wave of immigration that increases between 1830 and 1860, although you do have several people coming in the 1820s, especially Germans, even some Irish who work on the Erie Canal, for instance, and settle in and around Buffalo. These people are mostly English, Irish, Germans. They are Northern European, and they're for the most part going to settle in northeastern cities. Now, this third wave of immigration that we are talking about now is known as the new immigration. And that is roughly 1865 to 1920, right after the end of the Civil War, up and through 1920. Although some historians, they go more from about 1880 to 1920. Anyway, they were generally European, and about 20 million Europeans arrived in the U.S., you can see, between 1870 and 1920. Beginning in the 1890s, a lot more came from different parts of Europe than they had previously. They were coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So we have a lot of people who are Italian, Polish, Russian, other parts of Eastern Europe as well, Greece and the Balkans and places like that. They're coming here for economic opportunities. They're coming here for religious freedom. Now keep in mind, there's a difference religiously with these new immigrants. Previously, the majority of immigrants coming into the country were Protestant. Now we have a lot more Catholics, and we have a lot more Jewish people as well, especially when we're talking about Russian immigrants. Okay, so you have to keep in mind that some of these native-born Americans will not be so welcoming to these groups of people. Now, aside from European immigrants, we also have immigrants coming from Asia, and we've talked a bit about this group before. These are immigrants from China, and they started arriving in 1849. And yes, that is the time of the gold rush in California, and they would mostly be people who were settling into the West Coast. Actually, though, they weren't really coming here to settle. They wanted to make money rather quickly if they could, and then return home with that money. They were not allowed to own property. They were not allowed to become citizens. And we know, of course, that their labor was very important for the Transcontinental Railroad. They were very good workers, but remember, they were paid less than many of the other workers. There was a depression or a panic in 1873 that I've mentioned before as well, and they got a lot of blame for that. Their further immigration was halted with an act passed in 1882 called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and that would mean that no new Chinese would be allowed into America at that point. Another group of Asian immigrants would be immigrants from Japan. Many of these immigrants had first worked for Hawaiian planters in the 1800s. Now, Hawaii was not part of the United States at that point. However, in 1898, Hawaii is annexed and becomes part of the United States. That actually leads to an increase in Japanese immigration, not just to Hawaii, but to the rest of the country as well, particularly California and the West Coast, though. As a result of the influx of more Japanese, California orders Japanese students to attend segregated schools. So just like the segregation we see in the South and the Jim Crow laws with the African Americans, we're seeing something similar in the treatment of Japanese students in California. Teddy Roosevelt, who is the president in the early 1900s, he becomes president in 1901, he arranges a gentleman's agreement, and this agreement is between the United States and Japan. This agreement basically states that California would end segregation of the Japanese students that are already here. However, Japan would halt further emigration to the U.S., meaning Japanese leaving Japan to come to the United States. So this was another way that we tried to limit immigration from Asia at this period. Now, one of the questions is, why do people want to leave the places they were coming from? And we have to look at what are called push factors. What pushed them out of the places that they came from? First of all, there were population pressures in Europe. Industrialization there and the Industrial Revolution, again, that you remember from Global, led to overcrowding in Europe. And at the same time, farmland was scarce too, so your opportunities were limited in Europe. The economic conditions also pushed people away. Most farms have become too small to be really profitable. The cities were already encountering unemployment and political conditions as well. There was a lot of instability in many of the governments there. There was a lack of certain civil rights and freedoms that Americans did have. This, again, are things that you should remember from global studies and some of the conditions that were going on in Europe in the late 1800s. Pull factors, then, are things that draw people to the United States. And the first of these would be labor shortages. So we didn't have enough workers here to fulfill the demand for all of the different businesses that we had. And Europeans thought American factory jobs would be plentiful and well-paying. The well-paying part, maybe not so much. Also recruitment. So, for instance, railroad companies, they had land to sell, and they would actually recruit people from other countries. They would have salespeople basically working in other countries to encourage people to come to the United States because they had that land to sell. Remember, the railroad companies were given land and subsidies by the federal government to build the railroads on, and a lot of times they had excess land and they would end up selling that off. Also, steamship lines. We were talking about a period of time when the steamship becomes very important as a means of transportation, and it can bring passengers across the ocean very quickly, or relatively quickly. They also sought passengers, and they would advertise very aggressively to get people to pay the passage to come to America. Also, liberty was a big draw. The lack of political rights in Europe was a huge problem there. The lack of suffrage, or the right to vote for many people, as well the pogroms against the Jews in Russia and Poland that occurred, drove those people out. And many Eastern European countries required military service as well, and a lot of people did not want to do that. So these are all reasons that they're going to come to America, the land of the free, the home of the brave. That's the perception, at least, and they're going to come here. They're pulled here by that ideal of freedom and liberty. We need to look at methods of adaptation, or how these new immigrants fit in. There are three basically historical theories about how this has occurred. The first is the melting pot theory, that immigrants would gradually blend into a new American culture that combined the best elements of many cultures. There's also this assimilation theory, that immigrants should quickly learn English and adopt all aspects of American culture. And then there's the idea of pluralism, or what's known as the salad bowl theory, that there's no superior culture, and that each ethnic group should practice its own customs, respect unfamiliar customs, and adjust to the ways of a larger society. So there's been historical debate over how the immigrants have fit in, and which of these models is really the one that has been practiced throughout most of our history, and which one is the appropriate one. So I'll kind of leave that for you to decide. Now we need to look at the reactions to immigration, or against immigration, I should say. First of all, the Know Nothing Party. We talked about that was a party that formed before the Civil War. And once this new wave of immigration happens, what we see them doing is working to keep Catholics out of elected office. They want longer residency requirements before people become citizens. The Chinese Exclusion Act, which I mentioned before in 1882, it limits Chinese immigration. They had already been barred from certain jobs and occupations and owning property in California by that point. What you can see in the cartoon here is you see Uncle Sam holding his nose. And you see the person on the right, that's an immigrant. And what are they carrying? They have a lot of baggage with them, right? Disease, poverty, anarchy. There were all these fears that these immigrants were going to undermine American society and American culture. And plus, they needed to be taken care of too. They were generally poor people that were coming over here. You didn't have, that many wealthy people coming over, because people were coming because they felt they had better opportunities here. And so a lot of people were fearful of these types of people taking their jobs because they would work for lower wages, spreading diseases even, spreading radical political ideals. So a lot of these people were not welcome by the native-born Americans. Further reactions against immigration are going to include the Gentleman's Agreement that I mentioned earlier. That's when Teddy Roosevelt is president. It's saying California will end segregation of Japanese students, while Japanese would end their emigration of people out of Japan to the United States. We're also going to see literacy tests towards the end of the period, in 1917. Notice this is the same year that the United States enters World War I. That's going to bar immigrants who could not read or write from coming into the country. This should be a familiar concept to you when we talk about literacy tests used in the South to keep African Americans from voting. In this case, it's being used to keep immigrants out of the country. This is also the same time as the Russian Revolution, so there's definitely a fear of radical people coming into the country and bringing that idea of revolution with them. We also have the Emergency Quota Act in 1921. This is going to limit the number of immigrants into the United States. A further act in 1924 is the National Origins Act, origin referring to where the people are coming from. So this is going to create immigration regulations that are biased in favor of Northern and Western European people coming into the country, and against people coming in from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe in particular, places like that that tend to have more radical political type activity going on. So we see a resurgence of nativism happening in the country as a result of this new immigration. And we've talked about nativism before. Again, it has nothing to do with Native Americans. We are talking about native-born Americans. So these are people who were born in the United States and whose families often go back several generations here. And they had four main fears about these immigrants. First of all, that immigrants would deprive Americans of jobs and keep wages low. That the dominant culture deserved to be protected against foreign influences. That people believed that new immigrants were inferior. And so you have that kind of social Darwinist ideal behind this fear and dislike of immigrants. And as well, this belief that they might be connected with radical causes such as socialism or anarchy. And we certainly didn't want that in our country undermining our American way of life. So the immigrants came in, especially later in the period when you see the Russian Revolution in 1917, when you see the U.S. entering World War I, you will definitely see the laws that are limiting immigration in this country at that point. So the real true wave of this immigration is about 1880 to 1920, this new immigration that I've been talking about.